I'm LA based. I know we're all from different places, so I thought I would say that. I've been here for 25 years. I come from a farm in southern Missouri-Arkansas border in the Ozarks. And I wanted to start out with this piece. I was thinking about the presentation today and thinking about how I started needing and wanting to collaborate with scientists and needing their perspective. And a pivotal point for me was actually dealing with hard science in my body, dealing with chemotherapy and dealing with a kind of loss of an internal part of myself, and then needing to make a kind of record of that loss and finding that plants and animals and their lifespans, which are so much shorter for some, were an inspiration for me. And I was beginning to think that I was less interested in a human perspective on the planet, and I was much more interested in other species. And you'll see that shift completely now, I think, over let's see, 2009, so not that long ago. What is that, 8 years? So this is a latex mold of an apricot tree that was in my backyard that was dying. It's about 35 to 40 years old and had been truncated by humans over the years, and I just inherited this thing that was crumbling in front of me, and I decided to do this kind of effigy of it. And it's about 15 feet tall. So I am committed to object making. You'll see me fight with that too, though, where I move into sound, which I think a lot of us do, bounce back and forth. So there was an apricot on that tree, and it was the last apricot, and someone asked me, maybe the one thing a gallerist did that really was extremely positive in my relationship with gallerists was he said, I think you need to do a piece about that last apricot. I was like, okay, fine, I'll do that. And I did this slip cast porcelain, and I'd never worked with porcelain before or with ceramics before, so I did this attempt with a low fire glaze and thought it was kind of flat, but it was the beginning of a connection to materials that would solve a problem for me. I had been reading about the Plant Genetics Resource Unit at Cornell University, which is a Noah's Ark of orchards. They're in a book called Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan, and he had described these apples that are being housed there and kept alive there through grafting in exquisite detail in terms of their taste, the way that they looked, their shape, the texture of their skin, everything about them. And I fell in love with literally like one page of a book and had kept it around for 5 years and thought, I'm going to make work about that, but I don't know how. And then when I did that last apricot, I thought, oh, slip cast porcelain, I guess I have to learn that now. So that became a 3-year kind of journey of raising some funds to go to the Plant Genetics Resource Unit, collecting all sorts of apples there, convincing Cornell, this has to happen to me quite a few times over the last decade, convincing Cornell that I was a researcher, in fact, that I'm an artist and I'm an artist researcher, and to apply myself in that way, and that we have a very valid position as researchers at research institutions, and that we bring a very unique perspective to, for instance, agricultural research stations. So I was amazed by the variety there, and I brought home hundreds of apples, basically about 12 different varieties, and then chose 9 to make work from. This is Deacon Jones, which is quite huge apple. And I was interested in the kind of muscular nature, for instance, in this one, and its blush. And I began to make amalgamated versions in a different material, and then do molds of my sculptures that were these amalgamated versions of these. So this became a show that traveled for a little while. Pasadena Museum of Art was, well, I guess it started in New York and then it came here. And it was called Take Me to the Apple Breeder. So these are a series of works from that show. Kazakhstan Elite are based on a part of the orchard that was dedicated to collecting grass from the last wild apple orchards really on the planet, which are in Kazakhstan. There are hundreds of acres of them, and they're apple trees that are 200 to 300 years old. And they still, well, you have to understand or remember that when you graft a plant and then you keep an orchard of it, you're not letting any kind of natural selection happen. So the only place left on the planet where natural selection is happening in real time with real conditions in a deep level is in Kazakhstan for apples. That's pretty fucked up. Because what happens is that you've got all these apples all over the world, and we're trying to control them in order to make them be tenable for us as food. when the only place where we have the deepest experiment happening is in this wild forest. We can only do so much, although there is a lovely breeder who is doing quite a lot at Cornell, who introduced herself to me. So this is based on Kazakhstan elite, and those orchards are being harvested for firewood at this point. So this is another piece, Kazakhstan ash. And on the same day that I was there, I was only there for 48 hours. I had a 2-year-old at the time, or I think she was 2, and I was allowed a 48-hour leave. So I was running around trying to see and taste and grab all these apples, and I got this call on my cell phone from Susan Brown. She said, "I'm doing artwork over here on the other side of campus. You're at the curator's side where they're saving quote-unquote things, but I'm over here breeding, and you need to come and talk to me." I said, "I don't have enough time." She said, no, I'm coming over with the pickup truck. So she started driving me around to hundreds of acres, driving through really fast at dusk, looking at her crossbreeds. So these are clones that she is growing, and then she's crossing them to create new breeds. And she said, there is this amazing diversity that I get to do that only 3 breeders get to do at this level in the United States. So I'm creating new varieties for commercial growers at the largest corporate level, but I'm also using those funds to create smaller, different kinds of varieties and diverse varieties for upstate New York growers. So I'm trying to play both fields. So scientists also, I think, are really interesting in what they have to politically navigate, and I find their position very pragmatic and really realistic and really inspirational, because I can be in my head quite a bit when they have to deal with some really hard issues in terms of that kind of stuff. So this was, for instance, one of the rows, or a typical row that she would show me. Sisters is the name of the new, I use scientific language for the titling of these works. So sisters are the crosses. So she would take the pollen from one clone, put it on the flowers of another, take all the fruit off of that tree, take all the seeds out of them, plant all those seeds in a row of 1,000 trees, and then watch the diversity grow up over 7 years. Take it again, take the seeds from 2 or 3 trees that she liked, plant them again. That's why it takes 14 years to get a new variety. But we also now have genome projects in which we can shorten that up, but some of it can be shortened and some of it can't. So these are intense projects. And I found this differentiation between the trees, just one cross. Look at columnar. Columnar is the architectural habitat. You can see a triploid, 1, 2, 3, 4 in, that's gone wild, that has 3, as a cross of 3, but just in one tree. So what she would say is, my leaves are different, my fruit are different, they taste different, they're different colors, they're different shapes, they're different sizes, just in one cross. That in the depth of a genetic pool, in apples, they have more genetic material than we do, essentially, more chromosomes than we do. I think I've got that right. And so when they cross, they can actually be more diverse than humans can be. I love that plants, there are often a lot of plants that are actually capable of more diversity than we are. And I find great kind of regenerative power for myself and my practice when I think about plants possibly, or likelihood, outliving human species. And so I'm interested in that. These are 20 to 30 foot backdrops that I brought back with me to Cornell in the spring to shoot almost at the cusp of midwinter as we're going into spring, to get the skin of these trees and to get them as bodies, living bodies, and they're printed about 5 to 6 feet tall. And sisters weeping. And then I had an experience with bees at Headland Center for the Arts, in which I experienced a cold huddle of honeybees. So this is the beginning of a better nectar. And the bees were churning their bodies against each other, so they were making a sound that we're not associating with buzzing or with all the other things that we think about with honeybees. They were literally hitting each other's bodies in order to cause friction, in order to stay warm in November. And I found this clicking and lovely weirdness and kind of repulsion and mechanicalness of their bodies really attractive. And then I learned that cold huddle is actually a technical term for that particular way of making noise and generating heat. And I went back to a composer that I've worked with, a longtime collaborator, Robert Hone, and found out that in the 5 years that I hadn't seen him, that he started keeping bees. And curator Christina Newhouse said, I think it's time for you to make that bee piece that you've been talking about, which was to make a honeycomb hive laid prone and made human scaled. But I was getting bored with honeycombs, and I was feeling a kind of problematic relationship with the idea of colony collapse disorder that I was hearing on the news, and I felt like it was an oversimplification. And I teach research here at ArtCenter, but I'm not always the best researcher. I can't read every single book there is, and I don't, even the scientists tell me, like, you have to read my paper 40 times before you'll understand all the different things that I'm doing, and that is okay that you cannot. But you can come and hang out with me, and maybe you can learn it in a day, or you can learn what you need in a day and relate to it into a day. So I found that really refreshing, and I want to push that out to you. And when you collaborate with scientists, they understand that you cannot go into that paper as deeply as they can. So I was listening to Dr. Ann Leonard on the radio on NPR, and she seemed cantankerous enough. And I kind of need a little bit of that when I'm working with a scientist. And she also was talking about multisensory modalities. So for a lot of behavioral scientists working in entomology, they'll focus on one modality, so maybe vision or hearing or olfactory. And she was looking at the way all of these things were affecting memory and affecting the way that the bees would navigate out in the world. And she was studying bumblebees. So she said, yes, there is a problem with colony collapse disorder. We're only focusing on honeybees, and honeybees weren't meant to be here necessarily. They're not native. And we're trucking them all over the country and then shoving them with the same pollen over and over again, and then some kind of weird superfood and expecting them to exist and not get mites and not die. So it's complicated, and saving them and that mentality of saving them might not get us to where we need to go. We need permacultures in our agricultures that maintain a diversity of pollinators and feeding them healthy like we need to feed ourselves. So I went up and spent a couple days with her there, shooting her lab and having to deal with things like this, the naming and numbering of bees. These are bumblebees. And looking at these small colonies that she had and falling in love with this shape that was very geometric but very unknowable at the same time. And so I'm going to show you a little video of another thing that inspired me, which is this idea of buzz pollination. I might need more sound. Might not. Need to keep that open. So buzz pollination is a kind of pollination in which a pollinator needs, over evolutionary time, it develops a certain frequency in its body which matches a certain plant. And it's one frequency, so I always like to do this because proximity always messes with people's heads. It's the idea that if I'm a pollinator and I hit a certain frequency and I touch this flower, that I would release its pollen, and that only that flower would only release its pollen to me, that I'm a match for this being, and that only he and I can do this thing, and we can release this pollen and therefore propagate the planet. So I really fell in love with this idea of buzz pollination because it also meant that there was this song that was being sung, and it was for buzz pollination, it's one note. So, and honeybees don't have it, and your angiosperms in agriculture, the nightshades, most of the nightshades, which you might know, squash and peppers and tomatoes, they need that note, essentially. So I was interested also in this architecture of the closed vessels of buzz-pollinated anthers. So these anthers that have developed in flowers over evolutionary time to be closed and only open for that note. And I fell in love with, these are sculptures in and of themselves. So I love this drawing. I found that they were looking at these poricidal anthers in the lab, and that these bumblebees they were working with had that note, that they did buzz pollination, and that we needed it. And I started doing drawings of local and native flowers. This is a manzanita anther from the Theodore Payne Foundation. I was studying some there, looking at the anthers that had these closed vessels that needed that. And I took lots of photographs while I was with Anne, and then I started looking at her nectar guides and started trying to figure out how to translate those nectar guides into a piece as well. So she was training bees to look at fake flowers in order to open up their eyes and get them to relate to color, because her lab was beige. to work in this light labyrinth in which she would train them to associate certain color with pollen. And out of these ideas became a show, and so I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip from, oh wow, it's way down there. No, it should be way up there. From that show. See if I can talk over it a little bit. We're at 15. Could we have house lights down? Bumblebee nest. For a better nectar, I didn't have representations of bees in the show, or at least in the sculptural elements of this show, because I wanted to talk about the umvelt of the bee, of how it navigates the world. The cells are based on the circumference of my body when I'm curled up into a fetal position. So once again, going back into my body and trying to imagine myself in that position. You're hearing a score that's coming out of the nest all the time. It's a 5-part score. It changes with the time of day. It also has layers of score that go over it that change in relationship to a NOAA weather feed, to a National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency's weather feed for the area where the show is being presented. So Max programming has all of these parts of the score, and then median values are set for the site, for what the weather cues are, and then the score will change in relationship to those based on foraging patterns of bees in that area. And there's a data illustration on the outside, which I felt was necessary to kind of clue you into things. Other work that I had in the show is Bee Purple, which is a little blown out. This is a very simple collaborative work with technologist Elise Coe of taking pixels from photographs that Dr. Ann Leonard had taken of floral nectar guides, and then pulling color cues off of them to project them in the room. And the way that bees experience color is in rhythmic ways, not as solid objects. So I'll go into that a little bit later. This is Archistaphyllus, so this is those double anthers, and they are breathing a kind of pollen expulsion, my interpretation of a buzz pollinated expulsion, and tomato anthers that do the same, and then a research room. So this is an example of how we were trying to figure out what the changes in weather would do over time, and then what the names of the scores would be and how they would be changing over time. I work with Robert, and we had a 40-person chamber choir from Cal State Long Beach, which was amazing to work with. So we wrote the score specifically for the 40 parts for them. And they also did foraging one-offs from my graphical notation of what it is like to buzz and pollinate a flower individually. So there were 2 layers to the score. And then we did, this is my messy drawing of what happens when you try to do max and have a weather feed come in, and then how it would go into the cells, and max itself, and data illustration. And this is Elise and I trying to figure out if bees do not see shapes the way we do and look in planar levels at the world, they experience things, they see only when they're moving, and they see from all of those cones. So it's constantly rhythmic for them. They're not seeing the outline of a shape, they're seeing changes in pattern. So if I look across the room, all of you are of no interest to me except you, because you have plaid on, and so my eyes will catch your shift in your plaid. So you become my focus, and I'm moving straight towards you for a number of different reasons. Maybe I've left a magnetic trail, maybe I've done all sorts of things to make sure that I get back to you. But when I'm looking at you, I don't see anything about your shape. All I see is a shifting pattern. So I was interested in that different way of seeing and giving you a kind of blown up version of that in the exhibition and trying to translate that. And then we did a flexi. And then, of course, I always want to bring the sound back into something that's analog, so there was a catalog with that. And the last work that I'll talk about is more recent work, the ocelots of Foothill Boulevard, which was at the Bernard Biological Field Station. And this is Wallace Marty Meyer, who I worked with there. I was invited by curator Kira Ennis to do a project in this infirmary, which was built in the 30s and then shut down in the 70s and then completely boarded up in the 90s. So it had no sunlight in it since 1990, and it was opened up about 1.5 years ago. And Kira said, "Wouldn't you like to be the first person to go into that building?" And of course I said yes. When you do not have sunlight and you have rats and bat shit, then you have the possibility of the hantavirus and a number of other things. So it's a toxic environment for human species, but it's a great environment for rats and bats and spiders and all sorts of wonderful things. So, and it's in the middle of a biological field station, so it's completely closed off from humans other than the scientists, who are keeping a respectful distance because they don't acknowledge the shifting habitat of a ruin as something of study in the field station. So the field station is special in that it's connected to the Claremont colleges, and with 80 acres they have several different habitats, including a native California sage habitat that they can study and have been for years, but they left the infirmary alone. So in the recesses between the window and the boards, bees had made their comb, and it had been undisturbed because normally a bee comb might be disturbed by humans for honey or by another animal for honey, or by the bees leaving and needing to go somewhere else for a number of different conditional reasons. But in this space between being in a protected biological site and then one that is a human site and has some enclosures that are very tight but isn't bothered by humans, they were able to make their hives over time for a number of years and not go to rot, not move. So the comb was actually thick. So when you look at comb like this, the gold is the new honeycomb, and then the dark is where they've layered propolis to line the cells to sterilize them for their babies. And they'll do it over and over again if they're undisturbed. The building was being not demoed, but renovated, and essentially it was being gutted from the inside. So all the animals were being driven out within a number of weeks, and I was one of the first people to go in. So I said, before you drive out the bees, let's get a beekeeper in here to move them somewhere safely, and then let me have the comb, because the comb will go to rot. When you take the bees, you don't take the comb. And this comb is ancient in bee terms. The walls in a bee comb that's golden will be too thin to cast in any form because they're too, volatile, I guess, but too thin and too soft. But because this comb was possibly 20 years old, and there was a ton of it, it was thick enough walls, not really what's required of bronze, but it was thick enough to cast. So I was interested in portraying their life cycle. So this is bronze that's been patinaed, and then the bottom is a little bit of me letting it go to rot. Because when I pulled it out, miller worms hatched and started to devour the comb. So I had this interesting fight with having to freeze thousands and thousands of maggots who were devouring this comb with glee, and deciding whether or not I was going to kill them in their regular life cycle with the comb, which is very normal. The comb will disappear within 5 days because miller worms are always there waiting for that opportunity. And this is another piece from that. So these pieces were included in this show with Mark Dion, myself, and Dana Sherwood. I should mention that Mark was my mentor quite a long time ago in Chicago. So this was a reunion of sorts for us. I was also interested in the water in the basin and the fact that that in this infirmary there were telltale, like it had been gutted already of any furniture, but all of the plumbing was still there. And I had this very distinct vision of like a basin that had almost nothing in it prior, at the time in 1930s. And this biological field station allowed me to think that, because it was all these shifting habitats of plant and animal, but very little human contact. So this infirmary out in the middle of nowhere where they've piped in this water to keep these sick humans alive. And all of these features still were there. So during the show, I had lots of water elements. And the assumption is that water would keep us alive and is good for this basin. And what I was coming to understand from Marty was that the water that's being brought into the basin for our needs is destroying the habitats that have acclimated themselves to a different water level. So as we keep on filling, especially the surface level with water in places where it's not been before, in our lawns or in different places, it changes the habitat for instance, for me, I'm really interested in bugs. It was changing the spider population. And so I started, it's changing every population, but I started focusing on the spider population. So these were water elements that were running in the show, so there was the constant stream of water in the show. And the fire hose from inside the building as well. And then a series of very large-scale photographs of the sinks from various infirmary rooms. So it was a small hospital, and essentially the same setup in every room. And what happens when you put water on the surface level of ground are roly-polies. And once the roly-polies come in, then a whole different set of insects come in, and then we have the whole life cycle of different kinds of animals coming into an area. So I thought of the roly-polies as a kind of symbolic moment for the change from a basin that could handle its water in a very particular way, but that roly-polies were the symbol of human arrival. And this is Mark's installation, which I used to be his site person, finding field stations for him in Chicago. And so when I went to the infirmary, I found that the infirmary interior architecture that was left was a perfect place to take some of that out. And then he created a kind of field station for a subjectivity of a field biologist on that site. And these are some of the spiders that are native to that shifting habitat, which I've been looking at under the microscope for a while and doing drawings of them. There are 64 species of spider in 1 square mile of the Bernard Biological Field Station. With no elevation change, you would normally have maybe 120 or 150 over 18 square miles with 3 to 4 levels. You're in a basin that is extremely rich at every inch of its being. And I really felt that when I was looking at 64 specimens. I'm also looking at dead things, which is something that I do. And now I am going back to my farm in Missouri. I was about to sell the farm that I have there, and I had a change of heart within the last 4 weeks. Because I realized that the land is what we need to protect, and that I had a responsibility, and my work is very embedded in that land. And it felt like an ethical, it just felt untenable for me. I would give up my practice now in order to save that land and to keep it from being sold into sort of unknown hands. So that's what I'm grappling with now, is how do I live in the city, and how do I maintain a piece of land that I know like the back of my hand, and its 14 ponds. So I'm going to turn to other kinds of scientists, to the conservationists in Missouri, which also teach you how to use guns and how to do all sorts of things. And I also have been photographing, or been doing Super 8 of, and this will be the last thing that I show, of the cattle on this farm. And it's been a process with my stepfather. He's my last relative besides my daughter, and he's the one on the land. He said that when the last of the herd is gone, that he would leave the land. And we're down to now 7 cattle. So I've been shooting them over the last 2 years in Super 8 and trying to make a work about that. And in the process of that work, being able to separate myself from the mourning of my family and being able to rejoice in their life and the life of that farm and reattach myself to that farm. And I am seeking models for residencies around the country. So I went to Nancy Clem's farm, Camp Pachamankah, and have been wanting to do works about seeds. And Nancy has been working with Native American seed collections for a number of years. And so I asked her if she would honor me with allowing me to do sculptures of her seeds. So this is the beginning of a study for large sculptures of seeds as a kind of endless evolutionary development that will exist beyond us and